Hi, so my name is Jacia Omer, and today I will be covering A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi. Meanwhile, a Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon by Gwendolyn Brooks. So just a little historical context on this poem. This is a poem about Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black boy who was brutally murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Her name was Caroline Bryant. And her husband and her brother, days later, kidnapped Emmett Till. They beat him, they torture him, gouge his eyes out, take his teeth, and they throw him into the river with a 75-pound weight strapped and barbed wire to his back. So 3 days later, his body is found, and he is completely unrecognizable. But his mother decides to have an open casket funeral to show the world what happened, and it causes national outrage because he was so young, and it causes support for the civil rights movement. And just to note that this is a part of Brooks' collection, The Bean Eaters, that was published in 1960, and it focuses a lot on political and civil rights. And during this time, I'm sorry, I forgot the date. This happened on August 28th, 1955. But it's also important to mention that this happened around the time of the Jim Crow era. So that was a time where America saw the denial of the right to vote for African Americans, jobs, equal education. There was a denial of all that. There was segregation. You have the rise of the KKK. Police brutality and violence, lynchings, and death against the African American community. So it's important to keep that in mind, along with the backstory of what happened to Till. It's also important to note that in 2017, on her deathbed, Caroline Bryant admitted that she fabricated the story and that Emmett Till never touched her or harassed her. And she's quoted saying that nothing that boy ever did could justify what happened to him. So again, just keep that in mind when you're listening along or reading the poem. So it begins with ballad. It had the beat inevitable, it had the blood, a wildness cut up and tied in little bunches, like the 4-line stanzas of the ballads she had never quite understood, the ballads they had set her to in school. Herself, the milk-white maid, the maid mild of the ballad, pursued by the dark villain, rescued by the fine prince. The happiness ever after that was worth anything. It was good to be a maid mild that made the breath go fast. So here in the beginning, I have the word ballad highlighted just because it's something that is plot-driven and tells a story, and it can be tragic, and in this situation, it is tragic. So the speaker seems like it's Bryant herself, and she begins by reflecting on what happened to Emmett Till. Herself, the milk-white maid, the maid mild, again, it confirms that the speaker is Caroline Bryant. The dark villain is Emmett Till, and rescued by the fine prince, that is her husband. Here I also have highlighted that was worth anything because it shows the superiority of whites and how sometimes they would go to any lengths to prove their superiority. So continuing on, we have her bacon burned. She hastened to hide it in the step-on can and drew more strips from the meat case. The eggs and sour milk biscuits did well. She set out a jar of her new quince preserve. But there was something about the manner of the dark villain. He should have been older, perhaps. The hacking down of a villain was more fun to think about when his menace possessed undisputed breadth, undisputed height, and a harsh kind of voice, and best of all, when history was cluttered with the bones of many eaten knights and princesses. So here you just have her making breakfast for her family, and I have highlighted he should have been older, and undisputed breadth, undisputed height, because the villain is supposed to be big and threatening, and Emmett Till was not, and she's reflecting that he's not. and she knows that. Also, we have with the bones of many eaten knights and princesses. It would have been better to hunt a villain who actually harmed others. That would have made it worth it or justified. But in this sense, like I said, she's acknowledging that he was just a kid and what happened to him can't be justified. It continues with, the fun was disturbed, then all but nullified, when the dark villain was a blackish child of 14, with eyes still too young to be dirty, and a mouth too young to have lost every reminder of its infant softness. Sorry. So, again, the speaker knows his murder wasn't fun, and Bryant knows that it was wrong. Especially when you have here infant softness, it's just a reminder and a description of him being so young because he is a child. That's all he is. He's not a villain. So there was no fun in what happened to him. That boy must have been surprised, for these were grown-ups who were supposed to be wise. And the fine prince and that other so tall, so broad, so grown. Perhaps that boy had never guessed that the trouble with grown-ups was that under the magnificent shell of adulthood, just under, waited the baby full of tantrums. It occurred to her that there may have been something ridiculous in the picture of the fine prince, rushing, rich with breath and height, and mature solidness whose lack in the dark villain was impressing her. So I'm going to stop right here and then go back up to what I have highlighted. Again, these are just descriptions of her husband because her husband is the fine prince who's viewed as rescuing her from Emmett Till and her brother, so tall, so broad. So she points out that there's something wrong with two grown men attacking a child, especially because they can't compare to the child with size and height. They're way much bigger than him, way much powerful. And waited the baby full of tantrums just shows how these adults, like she said, are supposed to be wise, but they turn to violence and they turn to something that could have been avoided because they are supposed to be the adults in this situation. But they do act very childlike because they decide to take matters into their own hands. So continuing on, mature solidness whose lack in the dark villain was impressing her, confronting her more and more as the first day after the trial and acquittal were on, rushing with his heavy companion to hack down, unhorsed, that little foe. So much had happened, she could not remember what the foe had done against her or if anything had been done. The one thing in the world that she did know and knew with terrifying clarity was that her composition had disintegrated, that although the pattern prevailed, the breaks were everywhere, that she could think of no threat capable of the necessary silk work. She made the babies sit in their places at the table. Then, before calling him, she hurried to the mirror with her comb and lipstick. It was necessary to be more beautiful than ever, the beautiful wife. So here I highlighted the beautiful wife because you have her just tending to her daily duties. And she's painted as someone who is seeking approval from her husband. And we see she doesn't have much of an identity in this poem besides being a woman cooking breakfast and being a wife and being a mother. So I thought that was important to point out. And it's almost like she, tries to beautify herself to forget about what really happened. For some time she fancied he looked at her as though measuring her, as if he considered had she been worth it. Had she been worth the blood, the cramped cries, the little stirring bravado, the gradual dulling of those Negro eyes, the sudden, overwhelming little boyness in that barn, where she might feel or half feel the lipstick necessity was something apart. He must never conclude that she had not been worth it. So I highlight this line because this one shows the husband questioning his decision, and it describes Emmett Till, his Negro eyes, overwhelming little boyness. So again, it just shows the child that he was and the cruelty that he faced. He sat down the fine prints and began buttering a biscuit. He looked at his hands. He twisted in his chair. He scratched his nose. He glanced again, almost secretly, at his hands. More papers were in from the north, he mumbled. More maddening headlines with the pepper words bestiality and barbarism and shocking. The half sneers he had mastered for the trial worked across his sweet and pretty face. What he'd like to do, he explained, was kill them all. The time lost, the unwanted fame. Still, it had been fun to show those intruders a thing or two, to show that snappy-eyed mother, that sassy northern brown black. Nothing could stop Mississippi. He knew that, big fella, knew that. And what was so good, Mississippi knew that. Nothing and nothing could stop Mississippi. They could send in their petitions and scar their newspapers with bleeding headlines. The governors could appeal to Washington. So we have another shift here because the husband enters, and I have all these lines headlined because they just show that the husband hates the attention that he's getting, but he doesn't regret his actions, and he revels in the anger and pain that he has caused because he looks down on blacks, and he was able to show his authority and his force, especially because he calls them intruders, as if they don't belong or as if they're, worth nothing. And when I think of intruder, I think of that's usually someone who, if you have to enact violence against them, it's okay because they're intruding or they're threatening you. So the use of this word was very interesting because it's not who Emmett Till was, and he didn't pose a threat to them. And again, nothing could stop Mississippi. And what was so good, Mississippi knew that. This alludes to the husband being proud in what he did and how he was acquitted, and her brother was acquitted, and, no consequences came to them. So continuing on. What I want, the older baby said, is molasses on my jam. Whereupon the younger baby picked up the molasses pitcher and threw the molasses in his brother's face. Instantly, the fine prince leaned across the table and slapped the small and smiling criminal. So I have this one highlighted because, again, the child is harmed, just like Emmett Till was harmed. And it's just used as an excuse to hurt him because you have the child here called a criminal. And you could say Emmett Till was a criminal because his offense was whistling at a white woman, so that was seen as offensive. It was seen as, a dangerous activity when really it didn't happen, and it wasn't. It was just something innocent. But just like the child is innocently messing with the other child, they're harmed. So she did not speak when the hand came down and away, and she could look at her child, at her baby child. She could think only of blood. Surely her baby's cheek had disappeared, and in its place surely hung a heaviness, a lengthening red, a red that had no end. She shook her head. It was not true, of course. It was not true at all. The child's face was, as always, the color of the paste in her paste jar. So here you have the mother convincing herself that his actions are okay, and she's overlooking the harm that her husband has caused. And you also have the mention of red and the mention of blood that is going to continue in this poem. She left the table to the tune of the child's lamentations, which were shriller than ever. She looked out of a window. She said not a word. That was one of the new somethings. That fear, tying her as with iron. So I have this line highlighted because again, it's important to know that Emmett Till was tied to an iron cotton gin. So this just shows a part of the force and how he was weighed down and had no escape. Much of where she feels like she has no escape from her husband. Suddenly she felt his hands upon her. He had followed her to the window. The children were whimpering now, such bits of tots, and she, their mother, could not protect them. She looked at her shoulders, still gripped in the claim of his hands. She tried but could not resist the idea that a red ooze was seeping, spreading darkly, thickly, slowly, over her white shoulders, her own shoulders, and over all of Earth and Mars. So again, red is blood and is continuing to be mentioned in this poem, and I look as white as something pure, so it's staining her, and it's permanently damaging her view of her husband and showing the murder, and it's just showing how her perception of her husband has changed. And when she looks at him, she can only see what he did. She doesn't see him anymore. He whispered something to her to the fine prince, something about love. Something about love and night and intention. She heard no hoofbeat of the horse and saw no flash of the shining steel. He pulled her face around to meet his, and there it was, close, for the first time in all those days and nights. His mouth, wet and red, so very, very, very red, closed over hers. Again, we have reference to red and reference to blood. Then a sickness heaved within her, the courtroom Coca-Cola, the courtroom beer and hate and sweat and drone, pushed like a wall against her. She wanted to bear it, but his mouth would not go away, and neither would the decapitated exclamation points in the other woman's eyes. So I have this highlighted because decapitated, that's how you can refer to Emmett Till, because he was so brutally damaged. And exclamation points, which represent strong emotion. And when you're thinking about his mother and she's looking into her eyes, you could think that she might have saw pain, anger, sadness. Any of those emotions are what she could have seen in the other woman's eyes, which would be his mother. She did not scream, she stood there, but a hatred for him burst into glorious flower, and his perfume enclasped them bigger than all magnolias. The last bleak news of the ballad, the rest of the rugged music, the last quatrain. So I have that last line highlighted because she is now disgusted with her husband, and she's feeling a hatred for him that he chose to murder a young boy. And then, like I said earlier, that's all that she's starting to see him as. And I think it's because her husband was able to do these things to a boy when he's a father and she's a mother. So she's left to feel herself questioning the murder, and she's forever changed because of what happened. And, oops. So sorry. I don't know what just happened. And because it ends with the last quatrain, which you think of 4 lines, something that's equal, it's appealing, but it's no longer that. That's why it's called the last quatrain. So she's just left with remorse and resentment towards her husband. Overall, I think this was beautifully written, and the use of imagery and diction to convey emotion other than hatred for Caroline Bryant was brilliant. It puts us into her world, not to excuse her, but to see a possible perspective that would grant her some humanity, and adhere to Emmett Till's mother describing him as a hero for his death, which opened up the eyes of many to the cruelty of racism. And the poem concludes that he wasn't a villain, but a helpless and innocent child. And I think Gwendolyn Brooks did a really good job of portraying that in this poem. And in the beginning, I included a picture of Emmett Till just in case someone never saw his before and after pictures. So if you don't want to see it because it is brutal, you can just click off now. But I do want to show it because I think it's important, just like his mother thought it was important, to see, you know, what happened to him. And I think that's important in the context of this poem. So here's the picture again. If you don't want to see it, you can just click off right now. So this is the before, and this is his face. Like I said, he was unrecognizable by the time they find him, and it just shows the brutality and cruelty that he suffered.